What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little different. Given the fact that about 95% of my audience aren't actually subscribed, I'm going to venture a guess some of you are actually new here. Mostly what I cover is CRPGs, and mostly just RPGs in general, but I do play a lot of CRPGs. So, a lot of CRPGs are turn-based, and so are a lot of other games. Like tabletop RPGs tend to be turn-based. Pokemon is turn-based. So it's a very prevalent type of combat. And with CRPGs, it's particularly common because it's usually that or a form of combat called real-time with pause that allows you to pause the action. So there's pros and cons of both, but one thing that comes up on this channel a lot is people being unfamiliar with turn-based and not enjoying the speed of combat because factually it is of course slower than real-time with pause because everyone's taking turns, or just not understanding it really. So today, I wanted to talk about some of the strategies you can use to become better at basically any turn-based RPG. And I did struggle with that title for the record because I was like, if I put any turn-based game, people are going to be like, oh yeah, does this help you be better at Uno? And, no, it doesn't. So whatever. Anyways, turn-based RPGs is really what we're focused on here. Now, as the title of the video probably told you, we're going to be talking primarily about a concept called the action economy. Now, personally, this is a term I'm familiar with from playing Dungeons and Dragons and things like that over the years. It's a familiar enough term for those players, I think, as personally, it seems to come up in that particular realm very often. Now, if you're unfamiliar, action economy is simply the idea of who is taking what actions, how many do they get, how many does the opposing team get, that sort of thing. It's basically who's taking actions. Right? Like I said, we're going to discuss a few different ways to control the action economy. Broad concept across multiple games, but pretty much any turn-based game this will apply to. Any turn-based RPG, that is. The first thing I wanted to talk about in this regard is simply numbers, right? Having more players or characters or minions, however you want to call it, than the opposing team does. Now this comes up in D&D a lot. So there is a monster called a kobold. They are very easy to kill. They are very frail. Individually, you're never going to fight just one kobold, though. That's not how they work. They will swarm you with up to upwards of 10 or more even. And while you might not necessarily have a problem killing one, you're only going to get one action that turn. And then the next turn, you're going to be hit by 9 of them, assuming you killed one of them. So because of that, they're going to get more actions, thus affecting their part of the action economy, and they might kill you through sheer numbers. Now that's an easy enough concept by itself, right? But applying that to broader games, like Divinity Original Sin 2, the recently released Wasteland 3, the upcoming Baldur's Gate 3, the challenge isn't always just swarms of enemies. It's literally just maximizing your chances to attack. Now that doesn't always necessarily mean sheer numbers. So, for instance, in Divinity Original Sin 2, you can pick up a talent called Attack of Opportunity that will let you perform attacks of opportunity. So if a melee enemy, or any kind of enemy really, walks by you in melee range, your character will take a swing at them for free even though it's not their turn. That's a big one because you've just added an attack, albeit a conditional one, without really having to do anything extra. Now, speaking of Original Sin 2, the other big thing in Original Sin 2 is simply the summoning tree. Summoning in that game is so overpowered, and it's overpowered in just about every turn-based game, turn-based RPG, simply because it gives you more opportunities to attack. So, when you're summoning something, you're giving yourself something else to attack. You're giving the enemy something else to attack, which will then, cost them turns to attack with, because now they have to attack this construct and not necessarily you. AI is specifically, something that tends to be affected by that. Obviously, if you're playing against another actual person, that's not as big a deal because they're not going to necessarily attack the summon because they know that doing that is a waste of time and actions. So, to sum that up, basically you want to give yourself as many actions as possible. I've mentioned a couple ways here, but just to summarize, you want to do that through giving yourself as many party members as possible. You want to do that through summoning or using a skill that props up like a decoy or something like that even. And lastly, the thing I want to mention on giving yourself as many turns as possible is taking away turns from the enemy. So I have briefly mentioned this with your enemy's attacking, say, a summoned creature already. That is one way to do that. Factually, having more numbers, especially ones that aren't player controlled and thus aren't affected, by giving you a game over if they die, not only are you giving yourself a damage boost by that construct or whatever it is being on the field, you are actually also, in a way, taking actions from the other team because you're giving them another target to hit that isn't an important character. Because at the end of the day, if that construct dies, you're not bringing yourself one step closer to a game over by losing a critical character. And in many cases, it can just be resummoned if you prepared properly. Now, in addition to that, there are often, in any basically turn-based RPG, ways to just straight up steal turns from your enemy by stunning them in some way. Let's talk about Wasteland 3. Wasteland 3 only really has one way to do that, and it is to literally apply the status effect Stunned. That is just about the only way to steal a turn from an enemy. Unless you start combat so far away from them, the AI forces them to spend all of their action points running to you. That is also an option in that game. Status effects like Stunned or say Sleeping or something like that, anything that puts a character out of commission for a turn is what applies here. So in Wasteland 3, this doesn't come up a ton because, again, the only status effect that will do that is the status effect known as Stunned. Some games offer you much more in this regard, such as Divinity Original Sin. It is a very common one for that. There is Frozen, there is Stunned, there is Shocked, or, Electrocuted, really, which kind of leads into Stunned. You can put somebody to sleep. You can entangle them and thus make them out of range if they're a melee character, something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to completely disable their character, but if something effectively disables them, then that's just as good. Another thing you can use for this kind of thing is actually a charm ability, should the game offer one. Are you able to talk your way out of a situation? Can you talk an enemy that would normally be on their side onto your side? That's actually a bit of a double whammy, because not only have you stolen a turn from the enemy team, you effectively also given yourself an extra one at the same time. That's why charm abilities are often very effective, and thus often heavily regulated by a developer if it's a video game, or, the rules if it's a tabletop game, because that tends to be such a powerful move in terms of combat. All right, so to wrap things up, I suppose, the last thing I want to mention is a little difficult on the video game side on a first playthrough. On a tabletop side, it can be incredibly difficult because, that will change kind of like any session, really. But lastly, it's just knowledge. Knowledge of knowing what enemy you're facing, how many of them there are. Can you turn any of them to your side through dialogue, for instance? Are there circumstances leading up to this fight that you can affect that will then affect the number of combatants in the fight that is ahead of you? All of those things are very important and offer you chances to steal or take or earn, if you want to put it that way even, actions from the enemy's action pool, thus giving yourself more actions. So the way I play turn-based games, and if you follow my channel at all the advice I give on my builds is really just all about trying to control the action economy. If you are having trouble with turn-based games, that is where I suggest you start. Don't look at max DPS necessarily. I mean, obviously you want to do as much damage as possible, but it's not always about max DPS. Sometimes it's more about giving yourself more of a presence on the battlefield through as many actions as possible than it is actually hitting as hard as you possibly can. Because going back to that kobold scenario, if I only get one action against 10 kobolds, I might hit one of those kobolds so hard it blows up into a million little giblets. But if I only have a little bit of health, it doesn't matter how hard I hit that kobold, because next turn his 9 friends are going to destroy me. Anytime I play a turn-based game, I look for ways to maximize and capitalize on the action economy. And if you do that and you start to look for those things and how you yourself can do that, that is how you'll start beating these games on their highest difficulty. That's how they will start not feeling so incredibly slow, because hands down, that is a very real criticism of turn-based, and it is absolutely correct. It is slower than real-time with pause. It just is. In my opinion, it helps with that, and the fact that turn-based can just be boring. Find ways to make your team so optimal, or find ways to affect that economy in fun ways that it's not so boring, is the best advice I could give you in that regard. I think that's pretty much where we're going to wrap it up, guys. I certainly hope you found this informative. I certainly hope I certainly hope that you stick around, like, comment, and subscribe and all that jazz, because again, factually, 95% of my viewers are not subscribed. So I hope you hit that sub button so maybe I can start doing this in a more professional fashion, which would be really fun for me because we are slowly getting there. But more than anything, just thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.